Hello, and I'm Reverend Alison, and today we're going to pick up the story of Sarah and Hagar where we left off at the end of chapter 16. So I'm going to start this morning by reading Genesis 21 verses 1 to 21. The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son whom Sarah bore him, and Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God has commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named after you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water of the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, do not let me look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up and lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. And he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So here we are, as I say, picking up the story of Sarah and Hagar, of Isaac and Ishmael. And Abram and Sarah have become Abraham and Sarah, denoting the covenant between God and themselves. And God does what God has always planned, and Sarah falls pregnant, a miraculous pregnancy. But the conception and birth of this promised child Isaac is dwelt with in a very understated way, and in all of 8 verses. And Sarah goes from laughter to jealousy and bitterness as she sees the 2 boys playing together and realises they have a shared inheritance, and asks Isaac to cast the family out. And it's here the story deviates from the story in chapter 16. Abraham is distressed at what he's been asked to do, effectively to choose between his 2 sons. But God spoke to Abraham and said, do as Sarah says. But God also promises that because Ishmael is his son, God will make a nation of him also. Hagar always needs to do what God, Sarah or Abraham impose on her. And this time there's no water in the desert. It's an inhospitable place. And there's this tender scene of Abraham trying to provide for his family as he loads Hagar up with food and water and finally the child. Note we do not hear Ishmael's name. At this stage he is referred to as the child. And Hagar is cast out or exiled. And compare this to her leaving by her own volition in chapter 16. We have models here of both exodus and exile. Both times she departs from her land of bondage. We are told she departed, and by the first time of the use of the word she, Hagar becomes a person. She's not an object anymore. It is the first step towards personhood. She wanders, which suggests uncertainty, lack or loss of direction, even destitution. Inevitably the food and water run out, and Hagar anticipates the death of her child and places him under a tree and withdraws. She is putting both a physical and an emotional distance between the two of them. She keeps vigil. She lifts up her voice and weeps and prays. But we're told God heard the cry of the boy. And the use of boy here, again, is the first step to personhood. He has gone from the child to the boy. And Hagar's weeping is met with divine silence, the boy's weeping with divine speech. But then God spoke to Hagar and utters those familiar words, "Do not be afraid." Here, God, who has rescued Sarah on multiple occasions, rescues Hagar and provides a well in the desert. And all through this story, Hagar is referred to as she. She is the subject of every verb, and in the absence of a name, there is powerlessness. And from verse 17, the role of Hagar starts to recede, and the child starts to gain prominence in the story. But she is still serving her child when she gives him water from the well in verse 19, but also in verse 21 when she finds him an Egyptian wife. And it's at this stage something momentous happens in the language used. For the first time since the start of this sad dysfunctional story in chapter 16, she's referred to as a mother. It's a sad dysfunctional story because of the interference of humans who think they can sort things out in their own strength and their own plans. But a story which is elevated by the actions of God, who rescues or saves, who keeps his promises, and who provides for Hagar. And there are comparisons and contrasts between the two halves of this story. God fulfills his promises both to Sarah and Hagar, both whom have been rescued by God. The first wilderness scene is chosen by Hagar as she flees. The second is imposed upon her. And there's a real issue throughout this of not being named and being considered an object, which we see slowly beginning to lift. God made a promise to Abraham he would be the father of a great nation, but as a father of two male children, he becomes the father of two nations. Hagar is often passed over in our reading of Scripture, but in many ways she's a pivotal figure. She's the first recorded person in the Bible to receive a divine messenger, and the only person who dares to name the deity. She is the first woman to receive an annunciation, the first woman to receive a divine promise of descendants, and the first woman to weep over her dying child. And she did all this from a position of enslavement and bondage and abuse. This may be a text of terror, but it isn't devoid of hope.